I carried a sentence in my chest for 57 years. Not a long sentence, just 6 words, but they weighed more than anything I've ever held. More than lumber, more than grief, more than the full length of my own life. My name is Arthur Selden. I'm 79 years old. In the spring of 1967, when I was 20 years old and too young to understand what cruelty actually costs, I said something to a person I loved. I watched it land, and I watched what it did, and then I spent the next 5 decades pretending I hadn't seen it, pretending the wound I made had healed on its own, pretending that time was the same thing as forgiveness, which it is not, which it has never been, which I know now with a certainty that only comes from having tested the theory with your own life and found it completely, devastatingly wrong. I grew up in Decatur, Illinois, a city that smells like soybeans when the wind blows from the east and like the staley plant when it blows from the west. In the 1950s and 1960s, it was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, and the boundaries of your world were drawn by the streets you could reach on your bicycle. My father worked at the Caterpillar plant in a supervisory role that he was very proud of, and that paid well enough for us to live in a 3-bedroom house on Mound Road. My brother and I shoveled every winter without being asked, not because we were virtuous, but because our father had made it clear, without ever raising his voice, that shoveling the driveway was not optional, and that the kind of man you became was determined in large part by the things you did without being told to do them. My mother was a schoolteacher. She taught 4th grade at Garfield Elementary for 26 years, and she was beloved by her students in a way that I didn't fully appreciate until after she died, when people I'd never met came to her funeral and told me stories about things she'd said to them. She had a gift for seeing children clearly, for understanding what they needed before they knew how to ask for it. I think that gift extended to her own children as well, though I also think there were things about me that she saw and chose not to address. Not because she didn't care, but because she believed, as many mothers of her generation did, that boys needed to find their own way to the truth. My brother, Louis, was 3 years older than me, and everything I wanted to be. He was tall and athletic and easy in his own skin in a way that I never was. Louis could walk into a room full of strangers, and within 10 minutes, he'd know everyone's name and have them laughing. And I would stand near the wall and watch him, and feel a mixture of admiration and envy that I didn't have the vocabulary to separate into its component parts. I loved my brother. I also resented him, in the quiet, corrosive way that younger brothers sometimes resent older brothers who seem to have been given something at birth that you were not, some ease, some grace. Louis didn't do anything to earn my resentment. He was kind to me. He included me. He defended me when other kids gave me trouble. But none of that mattered, because resentment doesn't need a reason. It just needs a gap, a space between what you are and what you wish you were. And Louis was standing in that gap, whether he knew it or not. I need to tell you about Thomas Barlow, because Thomas is the center of this story. The person I hurt, the person I spent 57 years owing a debt to that I was too afraid to pay. Thomas and I met in the 7th grade in 1959, when his family moved to Decatur from Springfield. He was a quiet boy, thin, with glasses that were too big for his face, and a way of holding his books against his chest like a shield. And the other kids noticed him immediately, the way children always notice the ones who are different, the ones who haven't yet learned how to make themselves invisible. Thomas was not invisible. He was conspicuous in his quietness, in his careful way of moving through the hallways, in the way he flinched slightly when someone spoke to him too loudly. As if sound itself were a threat, I befriended him. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was genuine, because Thomas was interesting in a way that the other boys in our class were not. He read books that I'd never heard of. He knew things about history and science and music that made me feel like the world was larger than Decatur, larger than Illinois, larger than anything I'd been shown. He played the piano, not casually but seriously, with a discipline and a passion that I recognized even though I had no musical ability of my own. And when he played, his whole body changed. The tension left his shoulders, and his face relaxed, and he became someone else, someone confident and free. And watching that transformation was like watching a person step out of a costume they'd been forced to wear. But part of why I befriended Thomas was less noble than that. Part of it was that being his friend made me feel strong. Thomas was smaller than me, quieter than me, more vulnerable than me, and standing next to him, I felt like the version of myself that I wanted to be. The confident one, the protector, the one who chose to be kind rather than cruel. And that feeling was intoxicating in a way that I didn't understand at the time. But that I understand now, because it was not really about Thomas at all. It was about me. It was about using his vulnerability to construct an identity for myself that I hadn't earned. And that distinction between genuine friendship and the performance of friendship is one of the most important distinctions a person can learn to make. And I didn't learn it until it was far too late. Thomas and I were close through junior high and into high school. We spent afternoons at his house or mine, listening to records, talking about books, arguing about things that seemed enormously important. His mother, Eleanor, was a gentle woman who always had cookies on the counter and who treated me like a second son. And his father, Gerald, was an accountant who wore a tie even on Saturdays and who shook my hand every time I came to the house, as if I were a business associate rather than a 14-year-old boy. They were good people. They were the kind of people who made you feel welcome without making a production on it. And I spent hundreds of hours in their home over the course of 5 years, and I never once felt unwelcome, and I never once gave them reason to think I was anything other than what I appeared to be, which was their son's best friend. The thing I need to tell you about Thomas, the thing that matters, is that Thomas was different in a way that we didn't have language for in Decatur, Illinois. In the early 1960s, or rather, we had language for it, but the language was cruel, and the understanding behind the language was non-existent. Thomas was gay. I don't know when I first understood this, because understanding came gradually, not as a single revelation, but as an accumulation of small recognitions. The way he looked at certain people, the way he didn't look at others, the things he said, and the things he carefully didn't say. And by the time we were 16 or 17, I knew. Not because he told me, but because I'd been paying attention. And I think he knew that I knew. And there was a period, maybe a year or so, when this unspoken knowledge existed between us. Like a room that we both knew was there, but that neither of us would enter. And the fact that we didn't enter it felt, at the time, like a kindness. Like I was protecting him by not naming the thing. But I understand now that it was not a kindness at all. It was cowardice. It was my way of keeping the friendship on terms that were comfortable for me, terms that didn't require me to say anything brave or do anything difficult or risk anything at all. In the spring of 1967, I was 20 years old. I was home from the University of Illinois for Easter break, and Thomas was home from wherever he'd been. I think he was working in Chicago by then, and we met for a drink at a bar on Water Street that we'd been going to since we were old enough to get served, which in Decatur in the 1960s was about 17 if you looked old enough, and the bartender didn't care, which he didn't. We sat in a booth, and we drank beer, and we talked. And it was good. It was easy, the way it always was with Thomas. And then at some point in the evening, after we'd had enough beer to loosen the bolts on our judgment, Thomas told me something. He told me the truth. He told me what I already knew, but what he'd never said out loud. Not to me, not to anyone. And he told me because he trusted me. Because I was his best friend. Because he believed that the years we'd spent together had earned him the right to be honest. And he was right about that. He had earned it. He had earned it 100 times over. And I failed him. I didn't fail him dramatically. I didn't shout or throw anything or storm out of the bar. What I did was worse than that, in some ways, because it was quiet and precise. and delivered with the calm voice of someone who has rehearsed cruelty without knowing he was rehearsing it. I looked at Thomas, my best friend, the person who had just handed me the most vulnerable truth of his life. And I said, "I think you should keep that to yourself." That's what I said, 6 words. "I think you should keep that to yourself." And then I picked up my beer, and I took a drink, and I changed the subject, as if he'd told me something mildly embarrassing, rather than something that had taken him years of courage to say. And I watched his face as I did it, and what I saw, there was not anger. Anger would have been easier. What I saw was something closing, something shutting down, a light going out behind his eyes, and the expression that replaced it was one I had never seen on Thomas's face before, a kind of blankness, a withdrawal so complete that it was as if the person sitting across from me had been replaced by someone else, someone who looked like Thomas, but who was no longer willing to be known. We finished our drinks. We talked about other things. We said goodnight in the parking lot. I drove home and I went to bed, and I told myself that I had handled it well, that I had been practical, that I was looking out for him, that in 1967 in Central Illinois, the best thing a person like Thomas could do was exactly what I'd told him to do: keep it to himself, stay quiet, stay safe. And there was a version of that reasoning that was not entirely wrong, because 1967 was not a safe time to be who Thomas was, not in Decatur, not in most places, and the dangers were real, and I knew that. But the truth that I buried so deep, it took me decades to dig it up, was that I didn't say what I said to protect Thomas. I said it to protect myself. I said it because his honesty frightened me, because it asked something of me that I wasn't prepared to give, which was acceptance, real acceptance, the kind that costs you something, the kind that might change how other people see you. And I was 20 years old, and I was a coward. And I chose my own comfort over his dignity, and that is a choice that you cannot undo, no matter how many years you put between yourself and the moment you made it. Thomas and I drifted apart after that night. Not immediately, not with any dramatic break, but slowly, the way a crack in a foundation spreads, invisibly at first, and then everywhere at once. He stopped calling. I stopped calling. When I came home for holidays, I didn't look him up, and he didn't look me up, and within a year or two, the friendship that had been the most important relationship of my adolescence was simply gone, replaced by a silence that neither of us acknowledged and that both of us understood. I told myself it was natural, that people grow apart, that friendships from childhood don't always survive adulthood. And all of that was true in a general sense, but none of it was true in this specific case. Because Thomas and I didn't grow apart. I pushed him away. I pushed him away with 6 words. In a booth at a bar on Water Street. And then I spent the next 57 years pretending that the distance between us was mutual, was organic, was just what happens, when in fact it was the direct and predictable consequence of the worst thing I have ever done. I got married in 1970 to a woman named Patricia, who I met at the university. Patricia was smart and practical, and she had a laugh that could fill a room, and I loved her in the way that young men love, which is to say completely and without much understanding of what love actually requires over the long term. We moved to Peoria, where I took a job with an insurance company, and we had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. And we built a life that was, by any external measure, good, comfortable, stable, the kind of life that people in Decatur would have looked at and said, Arthur did well for himself. And I did. I did do well in the ways that are visible and countable: the house, the career, the family, the retirement account, the vacations, the grandchildren. But there was something underneath all of it, something I carried every day, a weight that I couldn't name and couldn't put down and couldn't explain to Patricia, or to anyone else, because explaining it would have required me to admit what I'd done. And admitting what I'd done would have required me to feel it, and feeling it was the thing I was most afraid of. The guilt didn't come all at once. It came in waves, over years, triggered by things I couldn't predict. A news story about a young man who'd been beaten for being gay. A movie that Patricia and I watched, in which a character came out to his friend, and the friend embraced him. A conversation with my daughter, Sarah, when she was in college, about a classmate of hers who was gay, and Sarah said, "I just don't understand how anyone could reject someone for that." And I sat there and I nodded and I said, "You're right." And I felt the floor tilt beneath me, because my daughter was describing exactly what I had done. And she was describing it as incomprehensible, as something that a decent person would never do. And she was right, and she was sitting across the table from a person who had done it, and she didn't know, and I couldn't tell her. I thought about Thomas often, not every day, but often enough that he was a permanent presence in my mind, a figure standing at the edge of my consciousness, waiting. I wondered where he was. I wondered if he was happy. I wondered if he'd found someone to love, someone who had given him what I had refused to give him, which was the simple, basic human acknowledgement that who he was acceptable, was worthy, was not something to be hidden or ashamed of. I wondered if he thought about me. I wondered if he hated me. I wondered if he'd forgiven me. And then I realized that wondering whether he'd forgiven me was itself a kind of selfishness, because it centered my need for relief rather than his experience of harm. And that realization, when it finally came, was one of the most painful things I've ever felt, because it showed me that even my guilt was, in some way, about me. Patricia died in 2019, breast cancer. She fought it for 2 years, and she fought it with the same practical determination that she brought to everything. And when it became clear that the fight was over, she accepted it with a grace that I will never stop admiring. In the weeks before she died, we talked about many things, the children, the grandchildren, the life we'd built, the things we were grateful for. And one evening, lying in the hospital bed with the light low and the machines humming, she said, "Arthur, is there anything you need to tell me? Anything you've been carrying?" And I knew what she was asking, not because she knew about Thomas specifically, but because she knew me. She'd known me for 49 years, and she could feel the weight I was carrying, even if she couldn't see it. The way you can feel a stone in someone's pocket when you embrace them. And I almost told her. I came so close. But I didn't, because she was dying and I didn't want to burden her with my guilt in her final days. And I told myself that was the reason. But I think the real reason was that I was still afraid. Still, after all those years, afraid of what it would mean to say it out loud. After Patricia died, I was alone with the guilt in a way I'd never been before, because she had been, without knowing it, a buffer between me and the full weight of what I'd done. Her presence in my life, her love, her goodness, had allowed me to believe that I was, on balance, a decent person, that the one terrible thing I'd done was outweighed by the many ordinary good things I'd done since. And maybe that's true. Maybe the math works out that way. But guilt doesn't operate on a balance sheet. Guilt doesn't care about your net score. Guilt cares about the specific thing you did to the specific person you did it to. And no amount of general goodness can cancel a specific cruelty. And I knew that. I had always known that. But knowing it and reckoning with it are two entirely different things. I decided to find Thomas in the fall of 2023. I was 77 years old. I had been carrying this for 56 years. My health was good, but I was not naive about the arithmetic.